A Bible reading from Ruth chapter 3. Naomi, her mother-in-law, said to her, "My daughter, I need to seek some security for you so that it may be well with you. Now here is our kinsman Boaz, with whose young women you have been working. See, he is winnowing barley tonight at the threshing floor. Now wash and anoint yourself and put on your best clothes and go down to the threshing floor. But do not make yourself known to the man until he has finished eating and drinking. When he lies down, observe the place where he lies, then go and uncover his feet and lie down, and he will tell you what to do." She said to her, "All that you tell me, I will do." So she went down to the threshing floor and did just as her mother-in-law had instructed her. When Boaz had eaten and drunk, and he was in a contented mood, he went to lie down at the end of the heap of grain. Then she came stealthily and uncovered his feet and lay down. At midnight, the man was startled and turned over, and there lying at his feet was a woman. He said, "Who are you?" And she answered, "I am Ruth, your servant. Spread your cloak over your servant, for you are next of kin." He said, "May you be blessed by the Lord, my daughter. This last instance of your loyalty is better than the first. You have not gone after young men, whether poor or rich. And now, my daughter, do not be afraid. I will do for you all that you ask, for all the assembly of my people know that you are a worthy woman. But now, though it is true that I am a near kinsman, there is another kinsman more closely related than I. Remain this night, and in the morning, if he will act as next of kin for you, good, let him do it. If he is not willing to act as next of kin for you, then, as the Lord lives, I will act as next of kin for you. Lie down until the morning." So she lay at his feet until morning, but got up before one person could recognize another, for he said, "It must not be known that the woman come to the threshing floor." Then he said, "Bring the cloak you are wearing and hold it out." So she held it, and he measured out 6 measures of barley and put it on her back. Then he went into the city. She came to her mother-in-law, who said, "How did things go with you, my daughter?" Then she told her all that the man had done for her, saying, "He gave me these 6 measures of barley, for he said, 'Do not go back to your mother-in-law empty-handed.'" She replied, "Wait, my daughter, until you learn how the matter turns out. For the man will not rest, but will settle the matter today." For the word of the Lord, thanks be to God.
Well, in my view, the book of Ruth could just as easily have been called the book of Naomi. Now, I know Ruth probably features more prominently in the text and that she's the one who's more often in the centre of the action, but it all happens on the background of Naomi's story. In fact, the whole book kind of begins more or less with Naomi in those tragic opening verses where, following the lead of her husband, Naomi leaves the land of Israel during a famine in search of food and stability, but loses everything. Her husband, both her adult sons, they die in Moab. Naomi's left destitute in a foreign land with 2 foreign widowed daughters-in-law. Her only hope really is to seek refuge back in Israel. And that's how the book of Ruth begins. And actually, it ends again with Naomi. As we'll see next week, the narrative section of this book, it closes with Naomi some years later back in Bethlehem in Israel, nursing her miracle grandson with the other Israelite women gathered around, looking on and declaring her blessed by God. It's a staggering turnaround. It's a story of redemption indeed, and I'm suggesting that to a significant degree, the book of Ruth is the story of Naomi. Now, of course, that said, the other key storyline here clearly is Ruth's. And hers too is a story of redemption. And in some ways, it's the more spectacular of the two. Because if you recall, Ruth is a Moabite, a foreigner, one of Naomi's two widowed daughters-in-law, and the only one who decided to follow Naomi back to Israel. And if it was going to be hard for Naomi to find refuge back in Israel, having deserted her people during the famine and now back poor and destitute, seeking to rebuild some kind of viable life for herself out of the ashes, then how much harder would it be for Ruth, a foreigner, with no claim by birth even to be in Israel, let alone to expect the people of God to receive her as one of their own? And so, yes, Ruth's story is also a staggering story of redemption, as we're seeing in this series, but it plays out within the story and the life of Naomi. For Ruth, I think the real turning point was back in chapter 1, when Ruth binds herself to Naomi's fate with these remarkable words. Perhaps you remember them. She says to Naomi in chapter 1, verse 16, "Don't press me to leave you or to turn back from following you. Where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God shall be my God. Where you die, I will die, and there will I be buried. May the Lord do all this to me and more as well, even if death parts me from you." That's the moment that Ruth's story gets kind of fused together with Naomi's. And we've been learning about Ruth, haven't we? About her character, that she's kind and loyal and passionate and hopeful, I think. I think Ruth really shows great hope here in Naomi, in Naomi's people, and in Naomi's God. She's binding herself not just to Naomi's fate, but also to Naomi's faith in the God of Israel. But Naomi, by now, has become a bitter woman, beaten down by grief and poverty and disappointment. She doesn't share Ruth's youthful hope for the future. She just can't see it. In fact, Naomi's understanding of God and the world assures her that God has been sovereignly overseeing everything that's happened to her in Moab, including the multiple tragedies. And so she concludes that it's God who has brought this calamity upon her. "I went away full," she says in chapter 1, verse 21, "but the Lord has brought me back empty." And so we have the lives and stories of these two women converging in the book of Ruth, an unlikely mess of faith and bitterness, tragedy and loyalty, hope and despair. And now we come to Naomi's moment. Well, chapter 3 is an interesting chapter. It's the turning point of the whole book. And again, it's Ruth and now Boaz too, who are central to the action. But again, this critical episode in the story is bookended in a way by Naomi. And in many ways, I think it really is her moment. Naomi's not lost her faith, but she has all but lost her hope. And we can understand it, yeah? Perhaps even identify with it. Naomi's struggle has not been with the sovereignty of God. She's not asking, is God real? Or is he there? Or is he powerful or in control? And no, as an Israelite, that was a given for Naomi. I don't think it would have even occurred to her to doubt the sovereignty of God. That God exists and that is ultimately in charge over all that he's created. Intellectually, that was more or less the starting point for the Israelite worldview, the first principle of Naomi's faith. And it is for the Christian too, right? And how often do we say, almost flippantly sometimes, that God's got this or he's in control. Nothing's impossible with God. He's the Lord of all. We sing about it and we rehearse these truths quite a lot, actually. In fact, I caught myself just this week saying to someone in a pretty casual conversation about what's happening right now in the world with coronavirus. And at some point I said, well, we know that God's ultimately in control. And it's not that that's wrong or that I don't believe it. Of course I do. It's just not really the sticking point for most of us, is it? I mean, that God is sovereign is not really what causes the tension in our Christian walk. It's what God is doing with his sovereignty. It's how he chooses to exercise his sovereign right and power to do whatever he wants in the world at large, and especially in the circumstances of our own lives. What governs God's decisions to intervene or not, to act in one way and not another? That's where the rub is, I reckon, for most of us. And it was for Naomi too. Naomi's wrestle was not with the sovereignty of God, not really. It was with the providence of God. And to a large degree, she'd lost hope that God had anything good left for her. And I don't know, but perhaps you're in a similar place in your walk with God today, where you're not sure anymore if God has a whole lot left in his plan for you either. Your faith's still alive, but at this point you feel, well, pretty damaged by life, and if you're honest, neglected by God. Well, I think that's essentially Naomi's story to this point. But now we see her spring into action. If you remember last week, Ruth met Boaz in the barley field. Boaz is a wealthy and righteous and a kind man. And he just happens to also be a distant relative of Naomi's, and one who, under Jewish law, had the power to dramatically change the future prospects both for Ruth and Naomi as a kinsman redeemer, if he is willing. And Naomi's been pondering this chance encounter, watching and waiting until the wheat and barley harvests are finished. And in that time, I think we're meant to see that her hope has returned. And now that hope, which no doubt is still somewhat tentative, nevertheless it permeates through every verse in this delightful chapter, beginning with Naomi's decision now to act. And let me just reread for us those first 5 verses from today's passage. Naomi, Ruth's mother-in-law, said to her, "My daughter, I need to seek some security for you, that it might be well with you. Now here is our kinsman Boaz, with whose women you've been working. See, he is winnowing barley tonight at the threshing floor. Now wash, anoint yourself, put on your best clothes and go down to the threshing floor, but don't make yourself known to the man until he's finished eating and drinking. And when he lies down, observe the place where he lies, then go and uncover his feet and lie down, and he will tell you what to do." And then Ruth said to her, "All that you tell me, I will do." What we're seeing here, I think, is Naomi now re-energized by hope and on the front foot again. Well, what has changed? What moved her from bitter resignation to hope-filled action? Well, I think it was a fresh revelation of God's love. Ruth's unwavering loyalty, her unlikely encounter with Boaz, Boaz's compassion and generosity, the abundant barley harvest, all of it has been conspiring in Naomi's heart to break through her bitterness. And for the first time in a long time, Naomi is beginning to see the loving hand of God at work, the perfect providential care of her heavenly Father. Now, was her pain gone? Her grief resolved? The agonising questions she'd been carrying for years about why God had allowed things to play out in her life the way they had, were they all instantly answered? Well, surely not. The kind of suffering Naomi went through, actually all suffering really, well, it leaves its mark, doesn't it? But the deeper question still, and in the end, the more important one is, does God love me? Does God love me? That's always the more important question. Well, Naomi's decision to spring into action here isn't without risk. Risk of further pain and disappointment. Risk to Ruth, who's really making herself quite vulnerable here with this strategy to gain Boaz's attention. I do not recommend it as a strategy for use today. But the point is, as Naomi is starting to really see the loving providence of God operating in her life, her response is not simply to wait passively for God to reveal the next part of his plan. I mean, she is waiting for that. But with her newfound hope and growing confidence in the Lord, she takes a few steps forward of her own, not without risk, but in faith. And every believer has moments like this, yeah? Perhaps not quite as dramatic, but we all know what it's like to take a risk in faith. And maybe we've had a real sense of God's leading in some direction or decision in our lives. And in those moments, there is always a risk that God won't deliver what we expect, or perhaps in the way we expect it. That is a real risk in the Christian life. And I'm guessing that most of us know what it's like to have taken a risk in faith and for it not to have worked out as we'd hoped. And that's hard. Sometimes it's really hard, which is why we need to know more than anything else the unshakable reality of God's deep love for us in Christ, no matter what. Listen, the many why questions that come up in life for the Christian that can be so painful and disorienting for us are ultimately who questions. So often at root, our real struggle is not so much with what God does, but who we think he is, with his character. Feeling neglected, forgotten, ignored, punished, rejected by God, these are character questions. And the assurance we need to move forward in the Christian life comes not from knowing exactly how God is going to act in our lives, but that whatever he does or doesn't do, it's in love. And often it's only through suffering that we really come to learn that more deeply, eventually. And so Naomi's had a fresh revelation of God's love, and she's willing to take another risk in faith, and it plays out beautifully. And it's a reminder, and perhaps a necessary one at this point, that God does outrageously wonderful things in our lives. He does. I mean, it's not our business to prescribe what God does in our life, to foresee his plans, but he does have plans for us. And I'm not sure we say that enough in evangelical circles for fear of it being misunderstood, but God has a plan for your life and mine, and it's consistent with his character. So it's good, and it's born of his love. And now I don't want to underplay Ruth's role now in all this. After all, from verse 6 onwards in this chapter, she and Boaz are at the centre of the action. But Ruth follows Naomi's instructions to a T, and her character shines. With dignity and care, she places herself in the way of Boaz late at night on the threshing floor. It's a pretty odd Jewish custom, let's be honest. But the idea here is that this is the clear signal to Boaz that Ruth wants him to exercise his right as kinsman redeemer, to marry her, so that she, and by extension Naomi too, will come under his protection and care, and so be restored to a full and fruitful life again in Israel. For Ruth, this is her opportunity for security and acceptance among Naomi's people. And for Naomi, this really means redemption from a life of disappointment and dishonour, and perhaps the end of her bitterness. It's a bold move, and one that's made in faith, and Boaz doesn't disappoint. After his initial surprise at seeing Ruth curled up at the end of his bed, understandable, he commends her in verse 10 for her loyalty to Naomi, for their plight is well known now to Boaz, and he knows that Ruth had other options here, but she honours her promises to Naomi. And I don't think it's being too Hollywood here to detect some romantic tension in this text. I think Boaz is very impressed with Ruth here and possibly quite excited about the prospect of marrying her, but he does everything right. He honours Ruth in how he handles the moment and honours Jewish tradition by deferring first to the closer relative. And there's a sign too for Naomi here, when Boaz sends Ruth home to her mother-in-law with a cloak full of barley. Remember in chapter 1 when Naomi declared in verse 19, "Don't call me Naomi anymore, call me Mara," which means bitter. "For the Almighty has dealt bitterly with me. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty." And now this cloak full of barley, this gift from Boaz for Naomi, it's a sign, a pledge that the days of her emptiness are over. She will be full again. In many ways, I think she already is. The great turnaround in Naomi's faith has already happened. Her confidence is in the love of her Lord again. Well, Naomi's life has been incredibly hard. And the pain of her years in Moab will not be forgotten. And she can see that God's doing something new now, an exceptionally wonderful thing through Ruth and Boaz, but God himself hasn't changed. Naomi will never solve the mystery of God's providence completely, but she knows that he can be trusted yesterday, today, and forever. And the fullness that she craves is found in knowing and trusting him. Well, the chapter ends, as far as the story is concerned, unresolved. Redemption's been pledged but not yet realised, and there's the small matter of that somewhat inconvenient closer relative to be dealt with, so we're left waiting with Ruth and Naomi for fulfilment. And when it comes to trusting in God's providence, there are times to act in faith, like Ruth bravely going to the threshing floor, and then there are times to wait in faith, and often it's the waiting that we actually find the more challenging. But on this occasion, Naomi and Ruth, well, they don't have to wait very long, unless, of course, you count all those years of struggle. Friends, in the final assessment, this book is not ultimately about Ruth or Naomi or Boaz. It's about Jesus. It's going to become very clear next week in the final chapter. This remarkable, confronting, deeply moving story of redemption was written on the pages of history and it's been preserved for us in Scripture to point us to the infinitely greater work of redemption that God would eventually do in Jesus Christ. Our threshing floor moment, if you like, when your redemption and mine hung in the balance, or so it seemed, has already happened. It happened when Jesus went to the cross and laid down his life as a willing sacrifice for our sin to redeem us back into the family of God. And here's the thing, it wasn't really in the balance, because it was the sovereign will of God that his Son should die and rise again for us, and the loving providence of God that accomplished it. Do you believe that? That it was God's deep love for you that sent Jesus to the cross. Because to know that is also to know and trust that that same love that drove Jesus to the cross is just as surely at work in your life right now, this very moment, in all the details, in 1,000 ways. Do you know that? Friends, following Jesus guarantees no one a pain-free life. But it does guarantee that nothing in life or in death can separate us from the love of God in Christ Jesus. It's true, God can lead us through some pretty dark and painful valleys, but never has he left us or forsaken us. That's the promise and the reality for every redeemed child of God. We might feel like the exception for a time or a season, but we're not. God does not neglect or abandon his children. Well, I want to close by reading a poem. It's a poem I wrote recently, inspired by the book of Ruth. If you saw the welcome sheet this week, you might have read it already. And it's my take on the book of Ruth, but through the eyes of Naomi. And it kind of captures a lot of what I've been trying to say in this talk in a lot less words. And I hope it will help set the scene for next week when we conclude our series. So here it is. It's called Call Me Mara. Mara meaning bitter. If I'd known, I never would have gone. Fleeing famine seemed fair, even faithful. Is not your desire for your people to be full? But perhaps it was in fear we left for Moab, and false hope we could evade famine's long arm. It matters not now, all is lost. Call me Mara. Returning empty, embarrassed, exposed, a widow for all to see, and to whisper she should never have gone. The only dignity left for me now is to own my plight. Call me Mara. The one surprise in all of this is Ruth, the foreign woman in the prime of life, caught up in a Hebrew tragedy. Why she refuses to let me go, I do not know. I will cling to you, she says. Or is it my God she clings to? Strange to feel some pride in the midst of this despair. Still, call me Mara. Yes, I am grateful for Ruth and for the barley harvest, signs that God may not have abandoned us to utter ruin. Then one day, as divine luck would have it, my dear Ruth meets Boaz, a kinsman redeemer, gentle, with oh such generous wings. At last my eyes can see the providential hand of the Lord, faintly at first, but true, as my bitterness is betrayed by grace. What is this mystery of divine providence that wounds one day and comforts the next? One thing I've learned is that you cannot flee the providence of God, but nor can you evade the long arm of his redemption. My friends, the severe mercy of God should never be sought, but sometimes it seems we must be emptied for hope to be reborn. It's true too that hope from the ashes is the last kind of hope and most to be prized because the Lord himself is its author. I now see the loving purposes of God in the eyes of a baby, my miracle grandson, and it is enough. Yet somehow I know, nursing this precious one, that this is just a foretaste of a greater redemption to come. I am Naomi. Call me blessed.